Today, we're going gothy. On this episode of Hollywood Parallel Universe, we will be investigating a case that you've probably never heard of before. That of the Black Dahlia.
Who's the Black Dahlia?
Everyone, this is my girlfriend, Stacey. Who is the Black Dahlia, you ask? Well, a woman by the name of Elizabeth Short.
Wow.
Yes. On January 15th, 1947, Betty Bersinger was taking a morning walk with her 3-year-old daughter when she looked over and noticed something in a vacant lot. At first she thought it was a mannequin because of how white its complexion was, and because the figure was separated in the middle. But when she looked closer, she discovered that it was a body, the body of a woman. She was cut in half and was lying face up, naked. She also had cuts all over her body, including 3-inch slits at the corners of her mouth. Pieces of flesh had been removed, and she had been hit over the head. She was also oddly posed, with eyes wide open, her hands above her head, and legs straight out and spread apart. After seeing the sight, the terrified Betty Bersinger fled the scene to a nearby home to call police. Shortly after, the LAPD, reporters, and photographers descended on the crime scene. When the LAPD arrived, they immediately noticed that there was no blood in the surrounding area, which meant that the victim had been murdered elsewhere before the body was dumped. Based on an initial examination, it appeared that she had been dead for less than 24 hours when she was found. A later report narrowed it down to approximately 10 hours between her death and her body's discovery. The police also noticed that the body had been scrubbed with precision, quite possibly to eliminate any evidence. Witnesses also reported seeing a black car near the lot around dawn, but other than that, there were no other immediate leads. With no identifying materials near the body, the LAPD sent the victim's fingerprints to the FBI, where they quickly identified the unknown woman as being 22-year-old Elizabeth Short, an aspiring actress in Hollywood. Elizabeth Short was born in 1924 in Medford, Massachusetts. In 1943, she moved to California to, some say, pursue her dreams of movie stardom. But in LA, Elizabeth struggled to make ends meet. Though occasionally she worked as a waitress, she was most often unemployed and would get by asking friends for favors. She also moved several times, residing in Hollywood, Long Beach, and San Diego. Unfortunately, the acting wasn't going too well either, as Elizabeth Short struggled to book even minor acting roles. At the time of her death, she had no known film credits. On January 9th, 1947, the evening Elizabeth disappeared. She was spotted at the Biltmore Hotel in downtown Los Angeles. Other sources allege that she was later at the Crown Grill Cocktail Lounge about half a mile away, but that was the last anyone ever saw of Elizabeth Short. Her whereabouts from January 9th until the discovery of her body on January 15th remain a small mystery to the even greater mystery of why she was murdered in the first place. Once police discovered the victim as Elizabeth Short, they set to work investigating her personal life. By all accounts, Elizabeth was a well-behaved young woman who dutifully sent letters to her mother on a weekly basis. The media sensationalized various aspects of Elizabeth Short's life. Newspapers and journalists vilified her by saying she was a woman who frequented jazz clubs and befriended so many men that it was difficult to know exactly who she might have been with at the time leading up to her death. Some stories made her out to be a seductive tramp, even suggesting that she was a sex worker, as if that somehow justified the crime. Details of her case, too, were fabricated. The very first LA Times article about the murder came with the headline, "Girl Victim of Sex Fiend Found Slain," and described Short as butchered by a sex maniac in an orgy of torture, none of which could ever be proven. The Black Dahlia murder, as it came to be known, became such a huge part of the public's consciousness at the time that it made front-page headlines in LA for an entire month. The negative depiction of Elizabeth Short's life, combined with the gruesome details of her murder, attracted many false leads, confessions, and eyewitnesses. In addition, it brought about several unusual pieces of evidence, including some that arrived at the headquarters of a Los Angeles newspaper in the form of letters, aka the Black Dahlia letters. On January 24th, 9 days after the body was discovered, an envelope arrived at the offices of the LA Examiner. The envelope seemed to be from Short's killer and was addressed using cutout letters taken from movie advertisements. It contained some of her belongings, including her social security card, birth certificate, photos, and an address book that was missing a few pages. All fingerprints were cleaned off using gasoline. In addition, another letter arrived that stated, "Turning in Wednesday, January 29th. Had my fun with police. Black Dahlia Avenger." All in all, 13 letters were sent to the police and press, apparently written by the murderer, taunting them as the investigation unfolded. But unfortunately, the arrival of these letters failed to lead police to the killer.
Because the letter arrived with some of Elizabeth Short's belongings, investigators naturally believed that this Black Dahlia Avenger was in fact the murderer. But who could that possibly be?
It was estimated that police questioned and cleared hundreds of people throughout the initial investigation, but one of the most prominent early suspects was Robert Manley, the last person to ever be seen publicly with Elizabeth Short. A salesman and former army musician, Manley first met Elizabeth when he saw her on a street corner one day and asked her if she needed a ride. In the days leading up to Elizabeth's murder, Elizabeth phoned Manley for assistance after her lodgings in San Diego fell through. Manley came to pick her up, and the two stayed in a hotel in Pacific Beach before Manley eventually brought Elizabeth to the Biltmore Hotel and left her there at 6:30 p.m. on January 9th. When police tracked Manley down after Elizabeth's murder, they discovered that he was married. They took him in for questioning, where Manley pleaded his innocence and willingly took 2 polygraph tests. After passing both, he was quickly released. Around the same time, an unusual development occurred when a second suspect, Joseph DeMay, came forward and sort of confessed to killing Elizabeth Short. An Army corporal, DeMay had been on several dates with Short just before her murder and even stated that he had been with her on January 9th or 10th in San Francisco, but drank so much that he blacked out and could not remember what happened. DeMay felt he may have murdered Elizabeth Short at that time. "It's possible I could have committed that murder. To the best of my knowledge, I am still not positive." However, this confession went nowhere when just a few days later, authorities at Fort Dix in New Jersey were able to establish that DeMay had actually been on his military base by at least 3 p.m. on the day Short's body was found, and that he could not have gotten back from Los Angeles by then had he been the one to move Short's body to the location where it was found. Aside from Robert Manley and Joseph DeMay, police questioned an additional 75 men that were listed in the address book that was sent to the Examiner by the Black Dahlia Avenger. However, no serious leads emerged. And by February 1947, 1 month after the murders, public fervor for the case declined and the investigation began to lose steam. Eventually, police found themselves at a dead end.
So why couldn't the police solve this crime, god damn it? Corruption.
In the mid-20th century, some police officers in the LAPD were notoriously corrupt, accepting payoffs to dismiss cases, turning a blind eye to known criminals, and providing immunity to various influential people. In the 1930s and 40s, the city of Los Angeles was rife with violent crime, gambling, prostitution rings, and drug trafficking, all run by notorious gangs and corrupt politicians and businessmen. For protection, these shadowy figures would pay off police to keep their legitimate businesses running, which may be the reason why one of the most plausible suspects in the Black Dahlia murder not only got away with it, but remained under wraps for so long.
This brings us to our most likely and most nefarious suspect.
George Odell Jr. was a wealthy doctor in Los Angeles who was described as a well-connected, dashing man with a high IQ that breezed through medical school when he studied to be a surgeon. He ran a venereal disease clinic in LA and had a vast social circle of influential people that included Man Ray and director John Huston. Notably, Odell was known for hosting parties at his home in Los Feliz, the iconic Sowden House, designed by Lloyd Wright. These parties were largely mysterious, though it was rumored that they involved sex, drug use, and other more horrific things that I'll get to later. Never outed as a suspect at the time of the Black Dahlia murder, George Odell was first brought to the public's attention when his son, former LAPD homicide detective Steve Odell, published a book of extensive research that pointed the finger directly at his own father. Released in 2003, the Black Dahlia Avenger presented some compelling evidence that George Odell may have been the killer. Upon his father's death, Steve says that he received a photo album of his father's that featured photographs of two women he believed were photos of the Black Dahlia. This prompted him to conduct an investigation, after which he came to believe that his father had a romantic relationship with Elizabeth that ended in her death. Aside from George Odell's surgical knowledge, which he never practiced but excelled at in study, Steve Odell found other circumstantial evidence that tied his father to the case. First, there was evidence that his father had 50-pound sacks of concrete sent to his home for remodeling on January 9, 1947, less than 1 week before Short's body was found. According to Steve, similar bags were found near Short's body that police speculated could have been used to carry Short's body from the car to the lot. Second, Steve Odell claimed that the notes allegedly sent by the killer after the murder matched his father's handwriting, and that he even had a positive handwriting analysis performed by a forensic expert that corroborated this. George Odell also drove a black Packard car, the same car that was spotted near the empty lot on the morning Elizabeth Short was found. Finally, and perhaps most disturbingly, it is said that the placement of Elizabeth's body matched the works of Man Ray, most notably Minotaur, a photograph in which the subject's arms are posed above the head. Steve Odell believes that his father wanted to be an artist just like his friend Man Ray, but chose to express himself through murder. The evidence that Steve Odell found during his investigation was so damning that some law enforcement officials seemed convinced that the case may have finally been solved. Stephen Kay, former LA County head deputy DA who prosecuted murder cases for over 35 years, even stated that he would have no qualms with charging Odell with murder. In response to these new allegations against George Odell, LA Times reporter Steve Lopez also conducted his own investigation by reopening the case files that existed at the time of the murder. In them, he was surprised to discover a photo of George Odell, which listed the doctor along with 21 other prime suspects. Lopez also found evidence that the LAPD bugged George Odell's home in 1950. One of the transcripts Lopez says he came upon had recorded Odell saying, "Supposing I did kill the Black Dahlia, they couldn't prove it now. They can't talk to my secretary because she's dead."
In addition, various police officers who were active at the time of the Black Dahlia investigation apparently hinted at their belief that George Odell was the killer. Chief of Detectives Thad Brown, who was also the lead detective in the disappearance of Gene Spangler, had allegedly even stated, "We know who killed the Black Dahlia. The case was solved. It was a doctor in Hollywood who lived on Franklin Avenue."
Now, it is said that George Odell had a rather unusual side gig, providing abortions to Hollywood's elite and the girlfriends of LA cops. Because of this illegal line of work and his connections with the rich and famous, Odell would have had extensive knowledge about corruption within the LAPD, which would be the exact reason why the cops would hesitate to pursue him as a suspect.
For it wasn't the first time that George Odell came under suspicion for a heinous crime.
Case in point. In 1945, Odell first came under suspicion over the murder of his secretary. Steve also notes his father was arrested in 1949 on charges of incest laid out by his daughter, Tamar Odell. Tamar Odell accused her father of sexual abuse, a claim that George Odell and other family members denied. The trial ultimately resulted in George Odell's acquittal, and he fled to the Philippines in 1950. In 2012, Steve Odell returned to the Sowden house with a search dog. While surveying the property, the dog picked up the scent of human decomposition in multiple locations. In addition, forensic anthropologist Arpad Voss tested the soil and confirmed the presence of human remains, believing that the remains would be found adjacent to the lot based on chemical distribution. Steve Odell is certain that this means his father may have committed various murders at the Sowden house, including that of the Black Dahlia. However, he has yet to receive permission to excavate the property entirely.
Many believe that the case of the Black Dahlia would be solved if only Steve Odell could sweep the area around the Sowden house. Even still, the LAPD admits that much of the physical evidence from the Black Dahlia investigation is not with the files, and it's unclear where it is or why it would be missing. Well, Stacey, what do you think?
About what?
Well, the Black Dahlia, of course.
Well, I already watched the one where Ryan and Shane discuss it, and I thought it was George Odell all along.
I don't know who Brian and Shane are, but there is one thing I know for certain. The media firestorm that resulted from the case negatively painted Elizabeth Short as a desperate and failing actress who may have even relied on sex work in order to survive, as if that validated the murderer's heinous actions. But in reality, Elizabeth Short was simply an innocent victim of a gruesome murder, a young hopeful who came to Los Angeles in search of a better life, but whose dreams were tragically cut short. As time goes on, public fascination for the Black Dahlia persists. Though we can theorize and speculate on the various suspects tied to the case, we may never know for certain
Odell.
who the real killer is. Tell us who you think it is in the comments. But for now, tune in next time for more strange happenings here on
Hollywood Parallel Universe.
Universe.